we'll begin talking about female reproductive physiology by talking about the HPG axis. And the HPG axis in females is the hypothalamo-pituitary gonad axis, just as it is in males. Starts up in the head with the hypothalamus, and then our anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. It's different in females than it is in males. In females, we have what's called a GnRH surge center. In males, this gets inhibited. So it's actually pretty interesting. To masculinize a brain, you have to have estrogen do that. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the default pathway for brain development and for genital development is female. So if you don't have the proper signals, then you'll just develop female. So if you don't have estrogen to inhibit the development of a surge center, then you'll develop a surge center. And what happens is it responds in a positive feedback fashion to rising levels of estrogen. So it's kind of weird. But GnRH is going to be the releasing hormone that gets it all started. It'll be released into our hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. It travels to the anterior pituitary where it's going to stimulate gonadotropes. Our gonadotropes are going to release two hormones, FSH and LH. FSH is the follicle-stimulating hormone. LH is the luteinizing hormone. Both of these hormones get their names for what they do in females. So in females, FSH is going to go and it's going to stimulate these cells in the ovary called granulosa cells. And granulosa cells are surrounding an oocyte, and they're going to support it and help it develop and grow. So we could say that they'll stimulate our granulosa cells to nurture the oocyte.
Did you say the granulosa are in the ovaries?
Yep. They are also going to, FSH is going to stimulate the granulosa cells to produce inhibin. So it's kind of neat. FSH sets up its own negative feedback loop because what inhibin does then is it's going to come back and selectively negatively feedback and inhibit FSH release. This is going to be important because we have to have an LH surge to cause ovulation. We can only have a surge in LH if we can have a surge in GnRH, but GnRH is going to stimulate both. So we can only have a relative surge in LH if we inhibit FSH. So it sets up its own negative feedback loop by stimulating these cells to produce inhibin. LH is going to stimulate other cells in the ovary called thecal cells. And what thecal cells will do is they will produce androgens that get converted to estrogen. So the overall effect is that by releasing LH and stimulating these cells, we're going to increase estrogen production. So we'll say that LH stimulates thecal cells, they'll produce androgen that gets converted to estrogen. So that's throughout most of what we call the follicular phase of our ovary. We'll look at that in a little bit. After ovulation, LH is going to be able to stimulate the cells that remain in the ovary to produce progesterone. So we'll say, and estrogen as well, but in addition, progesterone. So that whole phase after ovulation is called the luteal phase, and the luteinizing hormone is in control of that. So the other thing that LH will do is it will stimulate cells remaining after ovulation, we'll say remaining in ovary, and specifically it becomes called the corpus luteum, to secrete progesterone. Progesterone negatively feeds back on GnRH release and is going to shut it down. It's also going to feed back and inhibit LH and FSH to some degree. We'll have a little bit of LH still released throughout the luteal phase, but progesterone is going to be a normal negative feedback loop. Estrogen's weird, so that's why we didn't talk about it yet. We'll talk about it in just a minute when we go through the ovarian cycle. This is how the HPG axis works overall. And those are our hormones that are involved. Any questions?
So you said after, it's the cells remaining in the ovary after what?
After ovulation, it's called the corpus luteum, and they secrete progesterone. All those cells secrete progesterone, and progesterone has negative feedback. Estrogen's weird because it is going to cause positive feedback on GnRH release throughout the first part of the ovarian cycle. So it's not a straightforward negative feedback loop. This is one of the 3 examples of positive feedback that happens in the body. So we'll look at that in more detail in just a second. Alright, so the ovarian cycle is all of the changes that occur in the ovaries across about 28 days, an average of 28 days. So these are changes in ovaries every 28 days. And the first 14 days of the ovarian cycle are called the follicular phase. So these will be days 1 through 14. And during this time, what we're doing is stimulating the growth of a follicle. So let me actually draw a picture over here to kind of show you what's going on. In the female, we've got 2 processes going on. One called follicular genesis, which is making a follicle, and one called oogenesis, which is making an oocyte. So if this is our oocyte, that's going to become ovulated. At the very beginning of this phase, it'll have just a thin layer of cells around it. It'll be called a primordial follicle. Some of these cells will start responding to FSH and dividing, and it'll become a primary follicle. So these orange cells are the granulosa cells. And as follicle-stimulating hormone causes them to grow, we'll also see the development of a second kind of cell, our thecal cells. So during the follicular phase, folliculogenesis is occurring, which is the development of our follicle. So folliculogenesis is the growth of a follicle. And it'll go from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle to a secondary follicle to a tertiary follicle, and this is going to be the follicle that ovulates. And tertiary follicles are also called Graafian follicles. They're also called vesicular follicles. Sometimes they're also called antral follicles. But this follicle is going to be the follicle that ovulates. And what's really interesting, the female reproductive cycle in general is really confusing. It's really a lot different than male reproduction. And it takes about 84 days to go from this primordial follicle to a vesicular follicle. And in between there, you'll have many primary follicles and many secondary follicles, but only one secondary follicle is chosen every month to become a tertiary follicle that ovulates. They're not sure what signals cause that to happen. Reproductive endocrinologists are still trying to figure that out. So that's one process that's going on. The other process that's going on is oogenesis.
Okay, can you?
And this is...
I'm sorry, I just don't know what this says. Graphion, vesicular,
Graafian equals vesicular equals antral.
antral. Okay, and you said tertiary is the phase in which what?
This is going to be the follicle that ovulates.
Okay. Thank you.
At the same time folliculogenesis is occurring, oogenesis is occurring. And what happens in oogenesis is that we're going to take these oocytes that are in arrested development. Basically, when a female is born, she's got all of the oocytes she'll ever have. And they go through, they develop and they basically halt in meiosis so that they stay in like this dormant phase until puberty. And then once a month after puberty, well, it takes a little bit to get it regular, but after you've got the whole cycle figured out and the hormones are all working, then once a month, one of those oocytes will kind of finish the rest of meiosis. It doesn't complete meiosis 2, but it'll come out of that arrested development. It'll finish meiosis 1, and it'll get ready for meiosis 2. And then the only way that it completely finishes meiosis 2 is if it gets fertilized, which is kind of weird. That means that unless you get pregnant, you never actually make a mature oocyte. But oogenesis is the process of taking basically these oocytes that are in arrested development and beginning meiosis. So kind of getting them ready for maturation. So both of these processes are happening throughout the ovarian cycle. So, and throughout the follicular phase, we're growing this follicle. So this follicle that I have up here would be like a primary follicle. As follicle stimulating hormone continues to stimulate the development of those granulosa cells, then they are going to increase in number and kind of start filling up space around the oocyte, and they're nurturing its development and they're releasing inhibin. And then on the outside we'll have more and more thecal cells being produced. So if you look at what's happening at a hormonal level, this we could call a secondary follicle. And as it gets bigger, a couple things are happening. Inhibin levels are going up, so our granulosa cells are secreting more inhibin, and our thecal cells are secreting more estrogen. So we've got both of those hormones going up throughout the follicular phase. When we get to a tertiary follicle that's about to ovulate, it's got its oocyte that's almost mature. It's got to finish meiosis 2, but that won't happen unless fertilization happens. And what you can see is it'll have a lot of granulosa cells around it, and you'll see the development of this fluid-filled area called an antrum. That's why these follicles can also be called antral follicles, is because they've got a big fluid-filled area called the antrum. And what this is going to do is it's going to, as this tertiary follicle is getting ready for ovulation, LH is going to be weakening the wall of the ovary, and there's going to be a lot of pressure because of that antral fluid that's building up. So when we have the LH surge, and there's a lot of antral fluid here, it'll pop that oocyte off for ovulation. So it will rupture off of the ovary. This would be our tertiary follicle, or our Graafian follicle, or our antral follicle. And this is what's happening throughout the follicular phase. So through days 1 through 14, we're growing this follicle, and we are taking this oocyte from that kind of resting state and getting it almost through meiosis. So at this point, it's ready to enter meiosis, enter meiosis 2, but that won't be complete unless it's fertilized. So that's the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. And all during this phase, this increasing level of estrogen is going to stimulate positive feedback on GnRH. So this is one of the examples of positive feedback in the body, where increasing levels of estrogen are going to increase the release of GnRH. So GnRH is going to stimulate our gonadotropes and will increase the release of LH and FSH, but FSH is being hampered relative to LH because of inhibin. So you have more LH, you will have some more FSH, but it's not going to be as much as LH because inhibin is going to be negatively feeding back. So then what happens at the time of ovulation is we'll have an LH surge, and that's due to this positive feedback, where increasing levels of estrogen from the growing follicle increase GnRH, increases LH. An LH surge is what causes ovulation. So we'll say this is due to an LH surge. And there's a figure here in your book that shows, and I'll draw it at the end when we kind of review it all, but that shows the hormones and the varying hormone levels throughout the cycle. And you can see at the time of ovulation there's an LH surge, there's also a surge in FSH. And that's because we have a surge in GnRH. But the surge in FSH isn't nearly as big as the surge in LH because so much inhibin is being produced to feed back negatively and inhibit FSH's release. And if you look, you can see that, like, as far as absolute value goes, the surge in FSH is barely higher than the highest amount of FSH throughout the cycle. So it's the LH surge that's causing ovulation, and what's going to happen is this is going to stimulate the production of these things called prostaglandins that weaken the wall, and the oocyte ruptures basically off of the follicle. So we'll say the wall weakens, and antral fluid increases the pressure. So the oocyte basically pops off of the follicle, kind of bursts out. And it's going to take a few cells with it. It's going to take some of these granulosa cells that are here supporting it, and they're going to help support it on its journey through the ovarian tube. So we'll say, and some cells, let's say granulosa cells with it. Generally, fertilization will happen in the first third of the oviduct. So that oocyte's going to pop off that follicle and begin its journey down these fallopian tubes. And usually fertilization occurs up here. And so then the cell will begin dividing. Well, the oocyte will finish meiosis too. Then the cells together will begin dividing, and it will hopefully implant in that nice thickened endometrial wall. So this ovulation happens at day 14. So these little cells that go with it are sometimes called the corona radiata, sometimes called the cumulus ooiferus. But then what ovulation kind of looks like is you've got the fecal cells and follicular cells that will remain in the ovary, but your oocyte is going to begin its journey down the ovarian tubes and hopefully get fertilized. It's going to bring some granulosa cells with it, and that's what happens at day 14. So the whole follicular phase is under positive feedback of increasing estrogen levels. After ovulation, all of these cells that remain in the ovary become what's called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is going to be responding to low levels of LH that are coming from the anterior pituitary, and it's going to release both estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone has a very potent negative feedback effect. So as long as progesterone's high, it will shut down GnRH release. So we'll say this is going to have negative feedback on GnRH release. So as long as progesterone's up, it's going to shut down GnRH release. And then if we're not releasing GnRH, we're not really significantly releasing appreciable amounts of LH and FSH. There are low levels of LH that are going to stimulate the corpus luteum to produce progesterone, but it's not very high. And we want to keep these levels low. These cells are also still producing inhibin, so that we're particularly keeping FSH low. You don't want to stimulate the development of a new follicle and we don't want to stimulate oogenesis while we're giving this one a chance to go off and be fertilized. So progesterone is going to put this system to sleep, so that if this gets fertilized, then basically you're going to shut down this system for the rest of pregnancy. The placenta is going to take over making progesterone, but at first the corpus luteum will do it. So the corpus luteum secretes estrogen and progesterone and inhibin in response to low levels of LH. if you don't have fertilization, then it's going to shrivel up after about 2 weeks and become this structure called the corpus albicans, which is basically scar tissue. So all of this is happening during the luteal phase, and the luteal phase lasts from day 15 to day 28. And so this is when the corpus luteum releases progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Progesterone again is going to start this negative feedback on GnRH release. Inhibin is going to keep FSH low. Estrogen and progesterone are going to go off and stimulate thickening of the uterine wall so that if that ovulated oocyte gets fertilized, it's got a nice nutrient-rich uterus to implant into. If fertilization does occur, then that new little zygote is going to start releasing human chorionic gonadotropin. It's a hormone called HCG. So if this is our little zygote, then it will start producing HCG, which is what a pregnancy test picks up, and this will stimulate the corpus luteum to continue secreting progesterones and estrogens. And this will happen if this is fertilized. This happens for about 3 months. After 3 months, the placenta has to take over making progesterone. Because the corpus luteum will shrivel up and disintegrate after 3 months anyway. So absent fertilization, it lasts about 2 weeks. So this conversion, corpus luteum to our corpus albicans, this happens in the last couple days of the luteal phase, but this can only last about 2 weeks. If we've got fertilization, then the corpus luteum can only last about 3 months. At that point, the placenta has to start taking over progesterone production. If it doesn't, then you have miscarriage. So this is a very common time for miscarriage because a lot of times that the placenta hasn't taken over the production of our progesterone, and so then you can't maintain the pregnancy. So once this thing really starts dividing, you're going to see 2 different things form. What's going to become the fetus and what's going to become the placenta. Part of that's called the chorion. So it's human chorionic gonadotropin because it's coming from the chorion. This is going to be really important early in gestation because it's going to stimulate this corpus luteum to stick around and secrete progesterone. It's also really important to get those gonads developing appropriately because, and that's what the gonadotropin part of it is doing. These HCG is helping the gonads to develop in the zygote. Particularly important for male gonads to develop appropriately because, like I said earlier, the default pathway is female. So if you're an XY zygote, which is chromosomally male, you've got to get your testes developed and start producing testosterone that can be converted to that more potent androgen 5-DHT because that's what's going to bind androgen receptor and cause the duct system to develop male. So yeah. So that's our ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle and the changes in the hormones being produced in the ovaries lead to the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle is the changes in the uterus across about 28 days. So the ovarian cycle was under control of our gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH. The menstrual cycle is under control of our sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Menses is the first phase, or the first part of the menstrual cycle, and it lasts from about days 1 to 5. And what's happening during this time, if we look at the uterus, it's got these 3 different layers. This inner layer, the stratum functionalis. So if we look at the different layers, then we've got our myometrium, which is our smooth muscle. You've got on top of that perimetrium, which is our serosa layer, and then our deepest layer is called our endometrium, and it's got 2 parts. This is it's thinner than the myometrium, but as far as our naming them and talking about them, I just kind of made them bigger. So our stratum basale is the basal layer that's going to give rise to the stratum functionalis. The stratum functionalis is what's shed during menses. So when this corpus albicans, or this corpus luteum shrivels up and becomes the corpus albicans, it's going to drop our progesterone and drop our estrogen, so there won't be anything to maintain this thick functional layer. It'll undergo regression and start dying off. That's what will lead to menses. So menses is the sloughing off of the dead functional layer, and it died because progesterone and estrogen went down. So at the very end of our ovarian cycle, when progesterone and estrogen dropped off, that's going to cause the stratum functionality to die and regress. So it'll be sloughed off during the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle. Now if you think about it, days 1 through 14 were the follicular phase, so through in the ovary. So estrogen levels will be increasing during days 1 through 5, but we're sloughing off that functional layer, so we're not going to respond to it yet. When you hit day 5, we'll begin the next phase, the proliferative phase. And during this time now, those rising estrogen levels can stimulate our stratum basale. We just shed this off. So they'll stimulate our stratum basale to give rise to a new functional layer. So the proliferative phase goes from like days 6 to days 14. And during this time, estrogen is going to stimulate the endometrium to begin thickening. So it's going to stimulate endometrial thickening through mitosis. So when we have mitosis, we increase cell number. So this stratum basale is going to be able to give rise to some new functional layer cells, and it will begin thickening. So mitosis is going to increase our number of cells. And this is going to continue throughout the proliferative phase. So this layer is just going to get thicker and thicker through the first 14 days. Now after ovulation, when progesterone comes on board, it's going to begin the secretory phase. So the secretory phase goes from days 14 to day 26 about. So this is when we're going to have high progesterone levels causing two different things to happen in the endometrium. It's going to cause what's called hypertrophy, which is increase in cell size, and hyperemia, which is increase in vasculature and blood supply. So this is when we've got that corpus luteum secreting lots of progesterone. We still have estrogen, but progesterone is really, it's higher, and it's really important during this phase. So this is going to stimulate the functional layer of our endometrium to undergo hypertrophy, which is an increase in size, and hyperemia, which is an increase in blood supply and vascularization. So a couple things are going to happen. We're going to get more blood vessels, and we'll have the formation of what are called uterine glands. So all during this secretory phase, this functional layer is really thickening. We're increasing in cell size, we're increasing in blood supply, you're going to get more blood vessels, and we're going to get uterine glands formed. And that's going to form a nice, thick wall for that ovulated oocyte, if it gets fertilized, to implant into. You've got a chart in your book that brings it all together. I'm going to draw that up for you, because if you can understand that chart and put it in your own words, then you have everything that you need to answer an essay question. Look at the ovarian phase, or the ovarian cycle. We said that was under control of our gonadotropic hormones. So let's do a 28-day timeline. if we look at the beginning of the ovarian cycle, FSH levels are going to be slightly higher than LH. So FSH will be released. That's going to start stimulating the development of our follicle. As that follicle grows, it's going to be releasing inhibin. So FSH is going to drop down, but at day 14 we'll have a small FSH surge because of our GnRH surge. Then FSH is going to stay really low throughout the rest of the cycle. So if we look in the ovary then, what FSH is doing is it's stimulating the growth of this follicle so that we go from our primordial to our primary to our secondary. We could have a late secondary follicle, a tertiary follicle, and then we're going to ovulate. So let me actually redraw this. Different color. So FSH is going to stimulate the follicular phase in the ovary so that our follicles are going to get bigger and bigger, and then we're going to have ovulation. So this is our follicular phase. So we'll go from our primordial to our primary to our secondary. I guess I should draw a tertiary. Well, I can call this one primary, that's fine. Secondary, tertiary, and then we're going to ovulate. LH is going to be kind of lower at first, but as GnRH levels are going to go up because estrogen levels are going up, then LH is going to go up. It's going to continue to kind of rise as this follicle gets bigger. More estrogen makes more GnRH, makes more LH. We have an LH surge that causes ovulation. And then at the end, it's going to start dropping off and it'll drop below our FSH. So LH is causing the basically increasing levels of estrogen to be produced. So if we look at this follicle, it's increasing estrogen. And again, these increasing estrogen levels are feeding back positively on GnRH release so that GnRH is going to cause more FSH and more LH release. However, FSH is stimulating this follicle to produce more inhibin, so it's going to selectively negatively feed back on FSH release. It sets up its own negative feedback loop so that we can have an LH surge. There is an FSH surge as well, but it's not as big as our LH surge. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is going to develop. Out of all of the cells that remained in the ovary, the oocyte is going to go off and hopefully get fertilized. These low levels of LH are going to stimulate this corpus luteum to release progesterone. It's still releasing estrogen and inhibin as well, but progesterone is really what's going to be important for our secretory phase. So that was ovulation. Now this is the luteal phase of the ovary. And absent fertilization in this 2-week period then, this is going to shrivel up and become the corpus albicans, and all of our hormones are going to drop. As that happens, we will shed that, or we're going to kill off that functional layer, basically, and it will regress and we'll start menses. So then if we look at this, and we track our hormones that are coming from the ovaries, we can say, we'll call purple progesterone and blue estrogen, that throughout the follicular phase, as the follicle is getting bigger and bigger, it's going to be releasing more and more estrogen. Estrogen is going to peak at around day 14. It's going to cause that GnRH surge, which is going to cause our LH surge. We'll ovulate, there's going to be a slight dip, and then estrogen is going to go down. It'll still be pretty high, but it's not going to be as high as progesterone. And when this corpus albicans develops, it's really going to drop off. Progesterone has to stay low all throughout the follicular phase because it's a negatively feeding back. Progesterone is a potent inhibitor of GnRH release. We want GnRH to be released so we can have that LH surge. So progesterone has to stay low until after ovulation, and then it's going to go up. And throughout our luteal phase, progesterone will be higher than estrogen, and absent fertilization, it'll drop off right at the end. So our uterus is responding to this. So when we have this drop off of our estrogen and progesterone, that's going to cause that functional layer to die and regress. So throughout days 1 through 5, you'll shed off that dead functional layer. At day 5, these increasing estrogen levels will start stimulating mitosis in our stratum basale, so it'll give rise to a new thickening functional layer. So this would be menses. This would be our proliferative phase. After ovulation, when progesterone's high, it's going to stimulate that hypertrophy and hyperemia. So now we're really going to thicken that wall until those last couple days when our sex hormones drop off. Then we'll start some regression so that it'll die off and we can begin menses. So this would be the secretory phase. And during this time, we're getting more blood vasculature and our uterine glands. So it's really a nice thickened uterine wall then in response to progesterone.